Ya Ali Madad. My name is Alicia Alani, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to the series What Ismailis Believe on the Ismaili TV. This series aims to educate about the beliefs, history, diversity, and practices of the global Shia Ismaili Muslim community in easy-to-understand language. It includes short articles, explainer videos, interviews with scholars, and podcasts on all the Ismaili platforms. In today's episode, we will explore the significance of the Miraj of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family. I am joined today by Professor Ali Asani. Dr. Asani is the Murray A. Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University. The author of several books, including Celebrating Muhammad, Images of the Prophet in Muslim Devotional Poetry, and Ecstasy and Enlightenment, the Ismaili Devotional Literature of South Asia, Professor Asani has also been recognized for outstanding teaching. In addition, Professor Asani serves on the Board of Governors of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. Professor Asani, thank you for being here and being part of this conversation.
You're welcome, and I'm glad to join you today, and I hope we have a wonderful discussion today.
I'm looking forward to it as well. Let's start with the basics. What is Miraj?
So the word Miraj literally means a ladder, or also an ascent, something that you climb, and it refers in particular to an experience of the Prophet Muhammad. The experience is alluded to in a Quranic verse, which talks about how the Prophet traveled from the sacred mosque, from the Masjid al-Haram, to the furthest mosque, Masjid al-Aqsa. And then there are also allusions also in the Quran related to that he saw things, that he had visions, that he saw things, especially because people were skeptical about what he saw. So that's the core of this that is mentioned in the Quran, but through traditions, it's understood that these are allusions to an experience that he had. And that experience, in the course of this experience, he had a meeting, or he saw God, or he experienced God. And usually the story gets narrated in two parts, that first he was asleep in his bed in Mecca, and then the angel Gabriel came to him and asked him that woke him up and asked him that we are going on a journey, and they went to this Masjid al-Aqsa, which today is interpreted as the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. There he met the other prophets, they prayed together, and at the Dome of the Rock he began his ascent through the different heavens, accompanied by, on the one hand, angel Gabriel, and it's also said that during this journey he was mounted on a horse called Burak, and usually the horse is represented artistically with a female head and the body of a horse, and that these were the two who accompanied him on this journey. There are, because the allusions to it are so minimal in the Quran, traditions have developed this narrative about this journey, so there are many different accounts of this particular story of the Miraj.
Yeah, I imagine so. Can you expand more on how different Muslim traditions have interpreted Miraj?
So there's always been this speculation about whether this should be interpreted as a physical journey or a spiritual journey, or both. The interpretations of a physical journey, because the story is told about him physically traveling on this horse, and there was a sense that, we have, again, traditions that talk about that this journey was so quick that when he came back from this journey and he went in, his bed was still warm. So that sort of raises of questions, was this a vision rather than a physical journey? And so esoterically minded Muslims, including the Ismailis, have interpreted this as actually a spiritual journey, and this is just an allegory. And the spiritual journey involved this seeing. I'm going to put seeing in quotation marks, seeing God. Now, this notion of seeing God is something that pervades the Quran. There are Quranic verses talk about that everywhere you turn is the face of God. It talks about in nature you see the signs of God. God is also represented as a light. So this notion of seeing God and experiencing God is a very important discourse in the Quran. And now in the story of the Miraj, if you connect it with all these other allusions to seeing God, experiencing God, I would say that it is really trying to talk about that how do we know God. And basically, on the one hand, you can know God through the intellect, through reason, and that's where revelation comes in, because revelation, scriptures become a very important way in which we know about God. Like the Quran, for instance, it's a revelation from God so that we can know about God. So that's one kind of knowledge. But the Quran also talks about that there's another kind of knowledge that we're getting that is experiential. So what we see here is that there is what I would say that there's this knowledge of the heart and knowledge of the mind. The intellectual is, of course, mind knowledge, and then the knowledge of the heart is what you experience. And very often that experience of seeing, not literally, it talks about feeling something or experiencing something with the heart. What I think esoterically minded Muslims, including the Ismailis, believe is that what does it mean to see God, to experience God, and what are the prerequisites for you to be able to, quote unquote, see God with your heart. And this is where people would say that the greatest obstacle to seeing God is one's ego. Because so long as you have the ego, you have duality. There's God and there's you. But in order to see God, there has to be only one ego, and that is God. Because your own ego becomes the obstacle to that vision. So this is why they would say that in order to see God, you have to go from being egocentric, you transform yourself so you become God-centric. And once you're God-centric, then you can experience God. So that's really the idea behind, I think, the notion of the Miraj.
I find the idea of seeing and experiencing and this heart-mind knowledge concept really fascinating. Thinking about those esoteric interpretations, what does that say about how some Muslims conceive of the Prophet?
Yeah, so I think, I think we have to look at the Prophet of history in the 7th century Arabia, looking at his life, his career, his achievements, the different roles he played in society. So that's, I would say, is the historical Muhammad, the person. But these esoteric interpretations and other doctrines that develop around the figure of the Prophet is what I would say is the Muhammad or the Prophet through history. That is, how have Muslims associated various beliefs and ideas around his figure based on their understandings of who the Prophet was. And those understandings have changed over time. So what these esoteric interpretations tell us is that as people started to understand what is the cosmic significance of the Prophet, that he was not just a human being sent to bring a message, but there's some cosmic significance to this individual. and in fact to all the prophets. So how do we understand all of this? And so over the centuries, people were trying to understand the process of revelation, the significance of prophets, and therefore they developed various ideas about the Prophet Muhammad, not just as an historical figure, but what was his cosmic significance, and also what was his spiritual significance.
As we know, Ismailis place a lot of emphasis on the esoteric interpretation of things. Are there any instances of Miraj in Ismaili texts that perhaps viewers would be familiar with?
Yes, actually, Ismaili texts are filled with references to the Miraj. We have them in Ginans, we have them in Qasidas. One particular Ginan that comes to mind is from the Kalam-e-Mola, where it talks about that God's prophet attained the Miraj because of spending the whole night in meditation, and that the faithful, the mu'min, can attain that very Miraj, that very experience, by eliminating all the world's filth from their hearts, the purifying their hearts. So that, for example, it comes from a very famous work of in the Ginans. But this larger idea of this quest for spiritual enlightenment, the quest to experience the spiritual, that is in fact a core principle, I would say, in the Ismaili tradition. And specifically, if you think about how in the Ismaili constitution, the role of the Imam is described, and his primary role is seen as guiding murids to the path to spiritual enlightenment. So that whole experience that we've been talking about in this conversation about how do we experience the sacred, how do we experience the transcendent, is in fact a core principle in Ismaili thought.
Professor Asani, I've heard about concepts associated with the Prophet like Nuri Muhammad and intercession. Can you shed some light on those ideas?
Yes, let me start first with Nuri Muhammad, which literally means the light of Muhammad, or sometimes the Muhammadan light as it's called. So the Quran is filled with imagery on light. And so, for example, we have the famous verse of light, which talks about, God is the light of the heavens and the earth, and his light is like a niche in which there is a lamp, and the lamp is in a glass, and the glass is as if it were a glittering star, and so on. And so that, this representation of God as light, but that this light gets manifest through a lamp that is, which is kindled by oil that comes from an olive tree that neither of the east or the west. There's this filled with symbolism. So this notion of light, I think, is associated also with the notion of knowledge. So that speculation about what is the role of the prophet, what is the lamp that is being discussed, that is being mentioned in this Quranic verse. And very early on, people connected this notion of this lamp that's in this verse with another verse in the Quran that talks about the prophet as Siraj Munira, a resplendent lamp. So the idea becomes that, in fact, all prophets are like lamps, because through them the light of God shines into the world and guides people from ignorance, from darkness to light. And so people speculated that it's not just the physical person that we are talking about. There is a spiritual nature to that person. And what this is in fact reflecting is the that this person is spiritually connected to a larger cosmological order. And so based on that, you get speculations that, in fact, the first thing that God created was the light of prophethood, or sometimes called the light of Muhammad, because that light, through that light, God guides people to the right path. So this is the first thing that's created, and then it's seen as that this light was then first given to Adam. There are wonderful verses in poetry and so on about talking about how the light starts with Adam. In some accounts goes to Eve. There's a Turkish account that talks it goes to Eve, and then it goes to all the different prophets of the Abrahamic traditions. That includes Abraham, Isaac, Ismail, Moses, Jesus. They all have this light, and that ultimately this light becomes manifest in the historical Muhammad, where it reaches perfection. So this is this notion of this Noor-e Muhammad that gets transmitted through the prophets. And of course, for Ismailis, this notion of the light is very important, because after the prophet, of course, the light of guidance continues through the imams, through the institution of the imamate. So this notion of the light of the prophet, the light of the imam, are in fact very central to notions of spirituality in our faith, because this light becomes a way in which it guides murids, disciples, not just to life in this world, but also to spiritual enlightenment, and leads you to that experience. Now, connected with all of this is, of course, the notion also of intercession. The Quran talks about the special role of prophets, particularly the Prophet Muhammad, that he's not just a bearer of a message, he's not just a manifestation of a light, but he also represents authority. And there are many Quranic verses that talk about the authority of the Prophet vis-a-vis human beings. So, for example, those who pledge allegiance to the Prophet pledge allegiance to God. Similarly, there are other verses in the Quran that if you seek forgiveness from the Prophet, then God will forgive you. So the idea of intercession is that there is an intermediary between humans and God. And what you're seeing positioned in the Quran is this notion of prophets, particularly Prophet Muhammad, as an intermediary figure to whom people could appeal for forgiveness so that God could forgive them. So this notion becomes actually centrally tied to the notion of Muhammad, the Prophet, the concept of shafa, of intercession. And interestingly, this notion is then extended to other figures who are seen as being close to God. So for instance, in the Shia tradition, the imams, who are seen as enlightened beings who guide people to the right path, also have this power of intercession. And given that they're from the family of the prophets, so this idea that this intercession runs in the family of the prophets, the previous prophets, but also the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. So this becomes another central part of Ismaili belief and thought through the centuries. I would also say that it's not peculiarly Ismaili. You find this notion of the Prophet's intercession widespread in a variety of Muslim communities through the centuries. And you find, you see it in the prayers that people offer in many, many different languages, but you see it in poetry as well. I just want to give you some examples. So Ibn Khaldun, the great a North African philosopher of history, sometimes also called a sociologist, addresses the Prophet, grant me by your intercession for what I hope, a beautiful page instead of my ugly sins, like wipe off my sins so that my life is a beautiful page. Ahmad al-Tijani, who's a very famous figure from the 19th century, mystic from North Africa and has a great influence in West Africa, prays to the Prophet, I beg the favor of our Master, the Messenger of God, that he guarantee me admission to paradise without being brought to any account or undergoing any punishment. This idea of the Prophet interceding for the community is also based on accounts that you find in Hadith of like what happens on the day of reckoning, where people have to reckon for their deeds in the world. And very often those Hadith connect that at the time when you have to account for your sins, account for your actions in the world, the Prophet will be there to intercede for you. The notion that the Prophet can forgive sins, and you have mentioned in the Hadith, and then you see people pick it up in these poetic traditions, and you see a lot of poetries, requesting or pleading for the Prophet's intercession. So this notion then is picked up, I think, in the Shia traditions as well. So this becomes another very important facet, another very important way in which Muslims have related to the figure of the Prophet, and not only, I would say, the descendants of the Prophet in terms of his family, but also people who are seen as spiritually enlightened beings. So many Sufi sheikhs and peers, because they're seen as inheriting some of the knowledge and authority of the Prophet, are also seen as intercessors. So hundreds of thousands of Muslims go every year to shrines, to dargahs, to seek forgiveness of sins, to seek the intercession of these sheikhs and peers. So this is a widespread practice in the Muslim world.
Those were really beautiful examples and verses of poetry. And Professor Asani, you are the expert in Muslim literature and devotional poetry. Can you share with us some more examples of how Muslims have expressed the importance of Miraj through the arts?
The subject of the Miraj has been, of course, the subject of a great deal of speculation among Muslim communities through the centuries, because it's a story that calls for imagination, trying to think what does this experience actually mean and how does one interpret it. And one can talk about its interpretation in terms of doctrine and practice, but very often for artists, this has fired people's imaginations. All these different languages that Muslims speak, they all have poetry in praise of the Prophet, specifically focusing on the Miraj and, of course, other aspects of the Prophet's personality. There's also a whole genre of literature called the Miraj Nama, which is the treatises of Miraj, or the story of the Miraj, in so many different languages, notably Persian, Ottoman Turkish, and then also some other languages. And these Miraj Namas are composed as entire books that tell you the story of the Miraj. And the story of the Miraj is, let's say there are many stories of the Miraj. There isn't just one story. What I mentioned here is just a core idea. But that core idea is developed in different traditions in different ways. And so you can see through these miniature paintings where the scenes are, you can see the figures of different prophets. So in some manuscript traditions, you can see generally you see the figure of the prophet is veiled, so they don't try to show him as a person, but to show the notion of light. So not to talk about the physical person, but the luminous, the spiritual person, by showing a halo over his head. Other manuscript traditions, the prophet is in fact shown, so you can see the face is shown, but of course using the artist's imagination. So what you see in these artistic manifestations are the importance of the artist's imagination and how the story of the Miraj, how it's told, reflects certain doctrines and beliefs, but then how it's illustrated also shows some of the, interpretations. Can the prophet be depicted or not? And there's a wide variety of manuscripts that will show. Some will not show the prophet at all. Others will, so they'll veil his face. Others will depict the face of the prophet, so they don't have a problem with it. And I think a lot of those are determined by cultural attitudes. There's also an attempt to show the prophet through calligraphy. So that becomes another art form where not just the name of Muhammad, but how he's portrayed through calligraphic designs becomes important. And then we also have another art form in which the prophet is represented, and that are through these qasidas, these praise poems. And of course I talked also of the ginans. So you have, and the fact that these qasidas, these ginans, they have to be performed. So it's not just to be read. Very often there's instrumentation or just vocal music that is connected with that. And of course that brings us to the qawwali, the very famous music of South Asia, the Sufi music associated with groups in South Asia. Many qawwalis talk about the Miraj, and of course, and the whole the poetry is accompanied by very strong drum beats. There's a chorus, and quite captivating in itself. The beat of the qawwali is supposed to capture the heartbeat. So again, it's experiential, to make it resonate. So these are just some examples of how, in fact, the different arts are used to describe not only the prophet, but in particular the story of the Miraj. I would also say that connected with this, with the story of the Miraj and the figure of the prophet, an artistic representation, but also representation through poetry and through practices like qawwali and zikr is, of course, the salawat. And this salawat is, of course, the blessing, where you're asking God to bless the prophet and his families. In some salawats, they include the companions of the prophet as well. And this practice of reciting this prayer is, in fact, something that is mandated in the Quran. So there's a verse in the Quran, 33, Quran chapter 33, verse 56, which says that God and his angels shower blessings on the prophet. So, O you who believe, ask blessings on him and salute him with the worthy salutation, with the worthy prayer. So the basis of reciting this salawat comes from the Quran itself. And then there's another verse in the Quran in which the prophet was asked to tell people, say, I ask you for no reward except love for the near of kin. The qurba, meaning this has been interpreted as the family of the prophet. So including the family of the prophet in the prayers for the prophet becomes very common because of this other Quranic injunction that we should love the family of the prophet. So reciting the salawat for the prophet, his family becomes a way in which people express devotion to the family of the Prophet and love for the family of the Prophet. And so again, you see in many poems, the salawat is, comes up as a text all the time. And of course, in popular practice, many Muslims will often say, an abbreviated version of the salawat when reciting the Prophet's name. So they'll say, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet, may peace and blessings be upon him. But interestingly, they also use the formula of blessings when they're talking about other prophets as well, because they were seen as role models and examples.
Thank you, Professor Asani, for being here and sharing your time and knowledge with us. And thank you for watching. Look out for more episodes in the What Ismailis Believe series on all the Ismaili platforms. Thank you, and Ya Ali Madad.